Welcome to Solid Rock Christian Assembly. My name is Hina, and I'm so excited that you are joining us for our Sunday Christmas service. We are celebrating Christ. And one of the things I want to share with you today is that our personal relationship with Jesus is the most important activity that is in our life. It's the most important communication line that we will ever have. It was lost when Adam and Eve sinned in the garden, but restored to us through the birth of Jesus Christ, the greatest event in history. And we want to honor this great gift that God has given us, and we got to prioritize for 2020 to dedicate time for this communication life that will revolutionize our lives. Join us in the sanctuary and hear more from Pastor Audrine.
This morning, I'd like to speak to you on the topic, time with God. Prepare for a radical shift. Time with God. Prepare for a radical shift. There is a solution to every problem that you encounter. There's a remedy for every sinful situation that crosses your path. It is time with God. I believe time with God is the single most important activity in the life of any human being. Without it, we are hopeless. Without it, we wander into strange places. Without it, our perspectives are warped. Without it, we live elevator lives. Today we're up, and tomorrow we are down, and the day after that we can't function. We may as well be wearing a sign that says, Christian, completely out of service. Don't ask me to sing. Don't ask me to be joyful. The spirit of heaviness is my companion. I've said it, and I will say it again. I believe the single most important activity in the human experience is time with God. It has the capacity to change your life. Time with God needs to be the most important activity on your calendar for the year 2020. If you desire anything more than what you had this year or in the previous seasons of your life, time with God is the most important activity in your calendar year for 2020 if you desire anything more than what you had this year or in any other season of your life. I believe the most important activity for Adam and Eve was, as they lived in the garden, their time with God. All the days of their lives in the garden, they spent about the business of the earth, naming animals, learning what it meant to have dominion, and exercising what they had learned. But their success in understanding what their dominion meant, what this dominion looked like, how it was to be lived in their reality, came as a result of the cool of the day fellowship that the Bible speaks about in Genesis 3, verse 8, where it says, and they heard the voice of the Lord walking in the garden in the cool of the day. I am convinced that this could have been a daily experience for Adam and Eve. That this was not the first time that the voice of God had come to fellowship with them. A voice comes to teach. A voice comes to instruct. A voice comes to correct where necessary. A voice comes to reveal. And so I believe that for Adam and Eve, this was a time of teaching. It was a time of unveiling. It was a time of revelation for both of them as they got to know the God who had created them and the plan that he had for their lives. Their lives were fully and completely blessed as long as they followed the voice. As long as they did what the voice instructed, as long as first things were first. When being God was priority, everything was well. When learning his ways and doing what he taught was first, things were well. But when they listened and yielded to another voice, that which was not God's, things changed. This new voice led them away from the instructions of the voice that they knew and loved and trusted. This new voice encouraged them to do what felt good to them and not what God's voice had instructed. And when they gave in to what the self felt was good, when they gave in to their emotion, when they accepted the deceptive new voice that said this knowledge of good and evil would offer them more, everything around them suffered. Every single thing around them suffered. But I believe that the most important thing that suffered was their time with God. It was their access to God. It is true that they lost the sense of who they really were. Yes, they were fearfully and wonderfully made, but they had become self-conscious in a warped way and became ashamed of something that they were never ashamed of before: nakedness. They also now feared God in a way that God did not intend for them to fear him. They ran away and they hid from him. I cannot imagine what it felt like to be Adam and Eve when they realized what they had lost because of their decision. When they realized the changes that had been brought into being because of their decision. Everything that was beautiful became dark and contaminated. Everything as they had known it had changed for the worse, all because of a single exchange. One single exchange. The fatal mistake that Eve made was that she gave time to a voice that was not God's. She entertained an entire conversation, and we can see that in Genesis chapter 3. An entire conversation is recorded between Eve and the serpent that should never have happened. I dare say that if Eve had not entertained and given space and time to the voice of something other than the voice of God, she would not have ultimately chosen knowledge over God. She was tempted. That was fine. But she entertained a conversation that she should not have. And the deeper she got into this conversation, think of ourselves, the deeper she got into this conversation, the more subjected she became to her own logic and her own emotion. In other words, if it feels good, if it's not really harming anybody, then why am I being prevented from doing it? Think of it. If it feels good, if it's not hurting anyone, what's the big deal? It's the logic that hurt Eve that continues to hurt us today. It's the same logic that runs the world today. The measure of morality has become the measure of harm. The measure of harm, in other words, has become the measure of morality. If it feels good, if I'm not hurting anybody, what's the big deal? Personal rights now override principle. When we choose personal logic, when we choose emotions over obedience to principle, we end up needing to know through experience rather than enjoying the fruit of obedience. I'm going to say that again. When we choose personal logic and emotion over obedience to principle, we end up needing to know through experience rather than enjoying the fruit of obedience. It is a continuous challenge that we have with our children that God had with Eve. Instead of just listening and following the guidance of parents, young people, I want you to hear me very clearly today. Instead of just listening and following the guidance of parents and those who want the best for you, children think they know better than their parents. They listen to the guidance of other voices. They give space and place to other voices. These other voices that are introduced as they live and as they grow up. I believe there would have come a time, I do believe this, when God would have unveiled the mystery of the knowledge of good and evil to Adam and Eve. I do believe that. But only when the time was right and under the right circumstances. They were not yet ready for it. Young people, take it from me. Take it from me. You do not have to experience everything to know what it is. It is not important, it is not necessary for you to experience everything to know whether it is good for you or not. God knew the difference between good and evil. He knew the consequences of learning about it before it was time, before man had the necessary maturity to handle that information. But man wanted to know. And they were tricked into thinking it was better for them to experience it themselves. And as a result, suffered the consequences of it. My dear young people, I say to you today, ask your parents how many of them wish they had listened to their parents and followed their advice on certain issues. Ask them. Ask them. Many of them will tell you that they are sorry that they did not listen because their lives now are not what it could have been had they listened. Trust what they say. They ate of the fruit of their disobedience, but you don't have to. The thing that you so crave, that you have been warned against, is just like that tree in the garden. It is the same cycle. It's the same cycle. They saw it, they desired it, they disobeyed their father, went against his will, and did exactly what they were told not to do, and they suffered. They suffered. Their children suffered. We are suffering. Everything in the earth suffers because, hear this. Everything you do affects everybody that has anything to do with you. When you disobey, you don't disobey unto yourself. You begin a cycle of consequences that do not only affect you, but it affects everybody else around you, and it begins a new cycle for your own children. Obedience is always better. You do not have to walk a path to know what's down there. Listening paves a better way for you. Trust me. The things I obeyed in, I am so glad I obeyed. I look back and I'm so glad for the choices I made in obedience to what my elders told me. I am so glad. The things I didn't obey in, I regret. I stand here and I tell you, I regret having walked those paths. I didn't need to go there. I was told not to go there. I didn't have to experience those things. And today, I wish I had not gone down those paths. I beg of you today, listen, and I promise you, young people, I promise you, it will go well with you if you obey. Disobedient children have never had a good life. Check it out. Disobedience cannot bring right. It cannot bring good. Disobedient children have never had a good life. If you don't believe me, talk with some of the adults who are now suffering the effects of their own disobedience. But I digress. Adam and Eve lost time with God. And in losing everything that they lost, they began to try to fix their problem without God. The thing about their fix is that everything around them had now succumbed to the state of fallenness. So their disobedience had contaminated every single thing. And they plucked from that state of fallenness in order to fix their issue. Everything had now been touched by death. And so you could not find a permanent fix to anything that Adam and Eve was facing. Dead things cannot fix a living problem. As Pastor Layton alluded to a few weeks ago, the very solution that they found to their nakedness was itself a dead solution. The moment they picked those leaves started to die. The thing that they chose to hide themselves with was itself a problematic thing. and could only provide temporary covering for them before the fix itself started to fall apart. It's just like us. We are truly children of Adam and Eve. We outlaw, for example, certain psychoactive substances. We call them drugs. Because we have decided, and rightly so, that they're harmful to the human experience. Just giving you an example. But because people are wiser than the law, they break the law. So we take drugs because we look at it, we desire it, and just as Eve did, we think it's good for the human experience, so we taste of it. And so now we have a serious drug problem. But what do we do? What do we do? We pick a remedy that emerges from the problem itself. You see the cycle of sin? We pick up a remedy that comes out of the cycle itself. Guess what? We legalize drugs. And we're looking to legalize everything. Because the top man in the country, when I say drugs man, I mean legal drugs man, medical. The top medical advisor says the best way to go, the best way to fix the epidemic is just to make all drugs all the time, all available to everybody. Fig leaves. Just like Adam and Eve, we apply failing remedies time and time again to the problems we create. But God, who knows all things, arrives and he questions them, not because he's unaware of what they've done, but I believe that they needed to be accountable for what they did. They needed to recognize and come face to face with what they did. And this, I believe, is reflective in our very need to verbalize our state of sin and unrighteousness before God. We do not confess our sins to God because he doesn't know or he needs to know. We confess because we need to come face to face with the fact that we have sinned. And we must recognize that we need God's grace to cover. So he asked them a question, not because he was ignorant, but they needed to say it with their own mouth. This is what we have done. It follows, right, that when our children do wrong, we don't just allow them to scamper off and feel sorry. Even if they feel sorry in their hearts, that's not important. What's important is we say sorry. Say you are sorry to your brother. Say you are sorry to your friend. They must verbalize, I'm sorry for hitting you. We deem it important. It is important. God deems it important. And so for Adam and Eve, they needed to say what they had done. And so God applies a cover for Adam and Eve. And this too is a temporary cover because it yes, fades with time, but it was more permanent than the one they had chosen. But it was still something from a fallen state. The skin of animals was more permanent than leaves, but it still was not enough. It was an in the meantime kind of covering. Every remedy that was applied from the time of the original sin until Jesus came from something that was affected by the state of fallenness. But God knew these remedies were not enough. Sin had entered and damaged the relationship that God had with man. And so nowhere again did you ever see God's voice coming down in the cool of the day and fellowshipping with man. We'd lost that. Time with God was significantly affected. God now seemed to intervene into the lives of men from afar. His voice was heard less and less by man. And throughout times, mostly you would hear God speaking through specially chosen vessels. We call them prophets. Isaiah was one of them. Sin cost us time. Sin cost us access to God. And loss of time with God has produced the kind of earth we now live in. We want to know why there's so much suffering. And we blame God. It was loss of time caused by sin that has produced the kind of earth we now live in. There was a time when there was space in your morning to spend time with him. How many of us still do that? Don't raise your hand. Now getting children or ourselves ready for work. The length of time it takes to travel to work. the demands of our jobs, and our lives in general all take up the time that we used to spend with Him. As a result, you see people who say we're Christians and everybody else alike. Everybody is in the same boat, it seems, looking for solutions in a better book, in a better plan, in a better strategy. We pursue self-help so much. These books hit the top selling lists, one after the other after the other. We pursue family. All our time is taken up giving children everything else but an example of time with God. They know music. They know swimming. They know karate. Karachi, we used to call it. They know gymnastics. They know soccer and football and hockey and you name it. We are running from place to place trying to make sure they are equipped with everything else. These things are good, but none of these will satisfy the time and the space that time with God. That time with God will. None of these things will outlast what time with God gives us. Our kids need to know that time with God is the most valuable and important thing. It is a must-have in your life. Private time has suffered tremendously. God doesn't see many of us until we show up to church. You know what I mean? His eyes are always with us, but I'm talking about the time we spend with Him. He doesn't see many of us until we draw nigh with a half-crackled sound of praise, because some of us can't even get the breath out properly to give Him a proper praise. Private time has suffered tremendously. And we have come to depend on public time. There are parents who depend on sending their children to Sunday school. There were parents who depended on prayer in schools to help them out. At least my child is learning a little Bible. They have devotions in the morning. They have prayer. At least they will get a little bit of God. But can I tell you something? That public time that we were depending on is slowly being legislated away. We have gone so far as to take time with God out of public places. And surely, slowly but surely, we're seeing the effects of that. Prayer in schools have been replaced by shootings in schools, stabbings in schools. I think a few weeks ago, PG talked about Pastor Garth talked about a noted atheist that he's an atheist, and he's the one who is saying life was better when we had Bibles in public spaces. You can't go into a hotel anymore and find a Gideon Bible. It used to be there. You open the drawer, it's the first thing you see. It is being legislated out of public places, and the Christian doesn't even have it in the private place. Nativity scenes are being replaced by all kinds of other than godly scenes. Signs that remind us, public signage that should remind us that there's a God that requires certain standards from humanity. These are now being legislated down. Crosses are being turned upside down. Crosses are being covered in public spaces. Churches are being refused access to purchase property, and in some cases to even rent property for their services. Prayer in the Senates, prayer in Parliament, prayer in all these public meetings have been replaced by only God knows what. Time with God gave Adam and Eve a good and wholesome perspective on life. It provided them health in their bodies and health in their minds. Time with God does wonders for you. Time without God introduces warped and dangerous perspectives. It introduces problems with mental health. It introduces problems with physical health. And ultimately, it brings the death of the soul. But God, in the fullness of time, sent the only permanent remedy. But God, in the fullness of time, sent the only permanent remedy. This remedy is the original and only reason we celebrate Christmas, regardless of what people are trying to make it. This is where it started, and regardless of what we make it, it is where it will end. Christmas is for Jesus. It is a celebration of the birth of the permanent remedy to our state of darkness and sin. We lament the darkness, but we don't want the remedy. It is the only remedy that works. The blood of rams and bulls were remedies that came from a fallen state. But the blood of Jesus was never subjected to a fallen state. It is the only pure blood. It is the only heavenly blood. Fallenness cannot fix fallenness. Only the application of that which is untouched by sin can reverse the effects of sin. That, my brothers and sisters, comes only in Jesus. Reject him if you must, but it's the only remedy for the things that you seek. There's nothing else in history that rivals and compares to the birth of Jesus. Nothing. It was foretold. It was the only birth that was foretold hundreds and thousands of years before. In fact, God is so amazing that the first genealogy in Genesis announces the plan of redemption. Immediately, as sin took effect, a plan of redemption was announced. Not just thought of, but announced. It is written in Numbers 24:17. I see him. This is from way up in Numbers. I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob. A scepter shall rise out of Israel. It was declared many times, the ones that we're familiar with and the ones that we're not even familiar with just yet. But God declared there is a remedy for the state of sin. The prophets, one after the other, either outrightly stated it or alluded to it. Some even spoke of specifics, where it would happen, how it would happen. Nothing, my brothers and sisters, no matter, I'm going to get myself in trouble now. No other religion can claim what Christianity can claim. None. Can't even come close. This birth was prophesied repeatedly. And in some cases, in the specifics of it.
Are you ready to see how God will change your life? What new things he has in store for you in 2020? Stay tuned. Join us every Sunday at 10:30 a.m. and grow with us. Learn more about God. Be renewed, be transformed by his presence, and let his word change you, restore you, and give you life. Join us on Wednesdays because we dig into the word at 7 p.m. here. And you can also find more information on us on our website, Facebook, and our YouTube channel. We'll see you again at The Rock.
Solid Rock welcomes you.